Good evening, everybody, and welcome to Cinemagic 2020, a very different Cinemagic. I'm here in a virtual QFT. Very sadly, the QFT is closed at this moment in time, closed on its 52nd birthday. But I'm glad to say that we are going to have the virtual Mark Kermode film night. I did look up the word virtual, which means not physically existing. Another definition was also almost or nearly as described, but not completely. Would you please welcome Mr. Mark Kermode?
And I am almost or nearly as described, but not completely. And incidentally, I'm really impressed by your virtual background of the beautiful QFT. I'm in a completely non-virtual background of my room under the stairs. This is the sort of the smallest room in the house from which I've been broadcasting since March, basically, and it's so it's all the kipple and detritus of my life. But this isn't a virtual thing, bro. This is actually real. Like, this stuff is actually here. You know. You physically touch it.
Fantastic. Well, Mark, I mean, one of the visual tropes of this year, of course, is that we have seen inside people's houses. You know, we have seen bookshelves behind people.
Yeah.
And we are actually seeing inside, your work den there. So give us a sense of what may be behind you there. Can you look at one or two objects?
Yeah. So basically, I mean, what happened was, when just after lockdown happened, Simon Mayo and I started doing a television program because films had sort of stopped, and we started doing a TV program called Kermode and Mayo's Home Entertainment Service, in which we were looking at films that were released in cinemas but also to streaming. And this came from our homes, and they said, well, you know, we'll have to put a camera in, because they couldn't bring the camera. They had to just leave the cameras outside, and you put them in. Well, this is the office that I work in, and it's very, very small. And this is the bookshelf that's got so there is no order to it. It's just, so for example, so this is my favorite thing. Can you see this?
I can, yeah.
Okay, this is a face mold of Linda Blair's face as Reagan from The Exorcist that was given to me by Paddy Considine on my 50th birthday.
Wow.
On stage in Birmingham, and I think it's probably one of the best presents I've ever been given. This is an Elvis telephone. It's not plugged in at the moment, but when you ring it, Elvis sings and dances, and he's fully articulated. That's one of my favourite things. There is up here, I don't know whether you can see this, there is a huge bust. I'll just show it so you can move it. There's the huge bust of Elvis up there. Can you see that? Say hello to Elvis.
Hi, Elvis.
There's lots of silent running detritus. So this is like drones from silent running. As you know, we showed silent running at Cinemagic a few years ago now. And then there's just, you know, various books and stuff. This is literally just come in. By the time this goes out this morning, this is the new edition of my Exorcist book, which I wrote back in 1998. And they've just published it. I mean, the words are the same, but they've just published a new edition of it. It's the gift that keeps giving. So I'm going to put that there. And this is my favourite thing at the moment is this. I don't know whether you've seen this. This is a book by James King. It's called Be More Keanu. And it's basically a guide to how you can be more like Keanu Reeves. It's absolutely fantastic. It covers all the areas of his fabulousness. So yeah, so this is the detritus in which I live.
Well, that's great, Mark. It's great. Thank you for sharing that.
I mean, oversharing, I think, Brian, is what I've been doing.
I mean, what we've had to contemplate this year is obviously a world without cinemas. It's been such a bizarre experience for all film lovers. And I'm going to include questions that we've received on social media during our conversation. So one came in from Mary McBride, which was, what was the last film you saw in the cinema? So, Mark, you have been going to the cinema recently. So just tell us about that.
Yeah, so, I mean, I've obviously lockdown finished, and pretty much as soon as cinemas opened again, I went back to the cinema. So I think the first thing I saw in a cinema after what we think of as the first lockdown, was Unhinged, the Russell Crowe movie. And what was really interesting was that when Simon Mayo and I were doing the Kermode and Mayo's Home Entertainment Service, there'd been this trailer for Unhinged, which said, see it in cinemas. And this was at a time that cinemas were closed. And everyone knew that Tenet was coming, But the idea was that Unhinged was going to be the film that got people back into cinemas, and it's basically it's Duel meets Falling Down. It's Russell Crowe chases somebody around town in a big truck. But I saw it at the Showcase. I'm in the New Forest, which is where I live, and I went into Southampton to the Showcase cinema to see it. And the it's not great. I mean, it does what it says on the tin. But I was in a cinema, and the screen was very big, and I wore a mask all the way through, and it didn't bother me at all. And I really felt like, this is great. This is like being, back at home. And then obviously since then, I've seen Tenet, which I think is the one that, everybody thought of as the reason to go back to cinemas. I saw Bill and Ted, so I've been to, and then there's a cinema in Cornwall that I absolutely love called the Plaza in Truro. I went there, I did a talk about Shawshank Redemption. They showed Shawshank on the big screen because, as you know, one of the things that happened was all the distributors stopped putting out their blockbusters. So Bond got pushed back again, and, Mulan never made it to cinemas. But my experience has been that I've been to the cinema quite a lot, and so actually, weirdly enough, the last film I saw in a cinema was Shawshank Redemption, which is an old classic. But I've found it really positive. I have found that I've been to multiplexes and I've been to independent cinemas. I wish I was in the QFT now. Obviously everything's shut at the moment, but my experience has been that cinemas have handled it brilliantly, that they've really gone out of their way to make social distancing and cleanliness and all that stuff really good. And I've had very, very good experiences. And I know that a mutual friend of ours, Mark Cousins, has been regularly tweeting photographs of himself in a cinema wearing a face mask. There was one that he tweeted, which was a picture of him sitting waiting to watch Bill and Ted. And I know that people have been going to the cinema to see Saint Maud. And so, my experience of it has been great. I know that not everybody is ready to do that. That's fine, but my experience of it has been absolutely great. And as I said, at the point that we're talking, because this is a pre-recorded conversation, weirdly enough, the last film I saw in a cinema was Shawshank Redemption.
Now, Mark, as part of our film nights over the years at Cinemagic, we have debated many times the behavior of audiences in cinemas, whether it be noise, eating, mobile phones. But now, of course, we're faced with having no audiences in cinemas. And I wonder, has this changed, your attitude towards that in any way? And why do we need audiences? And what is it about the company of strangers that actually gives us, something to hold on to?
Well, it's a strange thing. At the moment, Simon Mayo and I on the Radio 5 show are doing this thing because it's 10 years since we introduced the code of conduct, the way to behave in cinemas thing, which was kind of a jokey thing, but we kind of meant it as well. And we were revising it for home viewing. Are there rules in home? Are you allowed to have a phone on when you're watching something at home? Are you allowed to stop the film to go for a comfort break, I think is the phrase? Are you allowed to look somebody up on the IMDb because you can't quite remember who they are if you're in the comfort of your own home? But whilst lockdown was on, I said, and I absolutely meant this, I said it's really funny because somebody who spent so much of their life complaining about the way people, misbehave in cinemas, because that is a fairly modern phenomenon. When I was a kid, people didn't have mobile phones in cinemas because mobile phones hadn't been invented. But I found myself saying, what I wouldn't give to sit in the noisiest, most badly behaved with, somebody munching popcorn and somebody else on their phone, what I wouldn't give to have that. And the reason is because seeing a film with an audience in a cinema that you love is a completely different experience. I mean, even in terms of preview screenings, usually every week I would go into London. I mean, I said I live in the New Forest, so London is 2.5 hours away. I'd travel into London, I'd spend a day watching screenings, 4 screenings usually in a day, then come back home, then go in again on Tuesday. So you'd see 8 films on a Monday and Tuesday, and you'd see them in little screening rooms with your fellow critics. You wouldn't necessarily talk very much or discuss the films, but just being in a room with other living, breathing people was a great thing. Now, I understand, of course, that at the moment, people may feel differently about that experience. I missed it, and I didn't know how much I would miss it till it was, what's that, Joni Mitchell, you don't know what you've got till it's gone. And I really did, and I really felt like weirdly bereft, because there is something about watching watching a film with, I mean, one of the most profound experiences I've had was in the QFT, watching Jeremy those years ago, the film that I hadn't seen since I was 12. And that, it was very different sitting there watching it in a room full. And as you remember, I just blubbed my eyes out. I was inconsolable. And then I was out in the bar, you know, and I was, that wouldn't have happened if I was watching it on my own. It was the fact that everybody else was, that David Holmes was there and you were there and, you know, my friends from South Parade were there. It just made it different. It made it a different experience.
Indeed, and hopefully those days will return, Mark, and you know we can get together again in the cinema and blub. I mean, we need to do that, don't we?
Brian, it's one of the great joys of cinema. I mean, you know, crying in public is not something you often get the chance to do, and the cinema is the place to do it. It's absolutely lovely. I remember somebody writing a letter to the radio show saying that they were really glad that Toy Story 3 was in 3D because they were crying so much. The 3D glasses were the only thing that preserved their dignity.
Well, Mark, we're recording this close to Halloween. And so you won't be surprised to hear that a lot of questions on social media have come in regard to horror films.
Yeah.
At this time of year, people's focus turns towards that. So let me just run through a few of these questions that we have received.
Sure.
Filth Timer asks, always wanted to know, do you like Halloween 3 Season of the Witch?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. And of course, that's one of the, I think, is it Kim Newman who uses that as a kind of, you know, are you okay or not? Because obviously it's out of the shift of the Halloween story. Yes, of course, absolutely, and it is one of those titles. That's a very good question. It's one of those titles like, okay, where do you stand on Halloween 3 Season of the Witch? Is it, yes, absolutely, I like Halloween 3 Season of the Witch, and I think you'll find that most horror fans feel the same way. You know, it's the left turn of this, but yes, absolutely.
Dr. Kate Gath asks, The Exorcist had a huge impact on the horror film genre. How do you think the latter would be different if The Exorcist had not been made?
Well, I mean, the thing, okay, so that's a hypothetical question which is hard to answer because I think The Exorcist was going to get made whatever happens. I mean, as everyone probably knows, there were other people attached to it. You know, Mark Rydell was actually signed as the director initially. And then, you know, recently there's been a sort of TV show version on, you know, one of the streaming services. And they're currently talking about remaking it. So I think it's hard to imagine a world in which a version of The Exorcist didn't exist, because also it's the 1970s, it was a hit novel. You know, think about things like The Godfather and Jaws. Really big hit novels got turned into movies. That's just what happened. But I think there's so much in the style of that film, of William Friedkin's film, that influenced horror. I mean, I love Saint Maud, and I was really proud, and you'll be proud of this, Brian. I wrote an entire review of Saint Maud without mentioning The Exorcist once. And I was really proud of it because, you know, I was talking about Stations of the Cross, and I was talking about Requiem, and I was talking about Lords, and I literally sat down and said, okay, I'm going to not mention The Exorcist in this review. And I had to try really hard because so much of the grammar of horror is in that film. I know I go on about it all the time, but it just is. You know, there's a couple of moments in Saint Maud which are absolutely, you know, Exorcist. Now, because I interviewed Rose Glass, and I thought I'm not going to mention The Exorcist, and then she did. You know, so it's like it's impossible to imagine a world in which a version of it doesn't exist. But I think the Friedkin film just changed the grammar of horror.
In line with that, there's a question here from the Fright Club NI, which has anything come close in the last 30 years to stealing your title of your favorite horror film? And if so, why?
I mean, you know, portal theory. There's the thing called portal theory, which says that you are particularly receptive to art, whether it's books or music or film or whatever, in a certain period in your life. The portal opens up, like, I think it's like when you're 8, and then it closes when you're 21 or something, and everything that you see, and no pop record you ever hear, no film you ever see, will have the same impact as that. And I am aware that portal theory puts The Exorcist right in the right place for me. There have been plenty of things that have really scared me and creeped me out. I mean, I'm very claustrophobic. I have a real fear of enclosed spaces. You know, I have this is, you know, my great fear is being buried alive. Okay, so let's hope that doesn't happen. But that is my big. So if I see a film like Buried, for example, in which the whole film takes place in a coffin, it just completely freaks me out. The George Slauser film, The Vanishing. The end of The Vanishing just gave me proper full-on nightmares. There's a film called Borderlands, which has got a sequence at the end of it, and those are all partly because they're good films and partly because they just push my buttons. I think there are other movies that have affected me as profoundly in terms of the way in which I loved Babadook. I absolutely loved Babadook. It didn't scare the life out of me, but I found it fascinating, and it didn't surprise me that William Friedkin loved it as much as I did. I loved Raw, you know, the Julia Ducournau film, which is a cannibal movie, but you know may not be a horror film. But so it's more to do with films that I've thought about afterwards. In terms of absolute sheer terror, the thing that really tends to scare me is, I mean, you could make quite a bad film in which somebody gets buried alive and it would scare the life out of me because I just have an absolute phobia about closed spaces.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with you about that. Certainly The Vanishing, I still have nightmares about that. And that's 32 years later. I mean,
yeah. And The Vanishing was one of the first films that the BBFC rated 12. It was when the 12 certificate had just come in. And I remember people going, 12? You know, it's one of the scariest films I've ever seen. And they say, yeah, but there's nothing in it. There's no violence, but it's implied, you know. But the scariest thing is the sight of a bloke with a match. So.
That is true horror. We have a question here about music, Mark, from Leanne Doran, who asks, we listened to your Music from Movies radio show on Saturday. That's on Scala Radio.
Thank you.
And wondered, is there any movie you loved but disliked the music score, or movie you disliked but enjoyed the musical score?
Okay. Oh, that's a great question. We did a thing on the Scala show, and thank you for mentioning it because I love that show. I'm really proud of it. It's just 2 hours of, you know, me playing stuff from soundtracks, and the Scala, God bless them, have been incredibly tolerant in letting me play, you know, stuff that's kind of, you know, very accessible, and also stuff which is frankly an atonal squonk fest. And we had a thing at one point which was, you know, a great soundtrack, shame about the movie. And we were asking people to suggest, you know, movies that were terrible but had great soundtracks. Because the soundtrack, if the movie doesn't do well, the soundtrack will often disappear. And somebody sent us the suggestion of S. Darko, which is the unofficial, well, it's official because the studio own it, sequel to Donnie Darko, okay? Which is terrible. The film is absolutely terrible, and everyone involved with the original has completely disowned it, but it has the most brilliant soundtrack. The soundtrack is just great, and I'd never heard it. Well, I'd heard it because I'd seen S. Darko, and it was just awful. I wasn't even listening to the soundtrack, and it was great. And in fact, we've played a few tracks from it since then, and I've always said to people, you know, no matter what you think about Cannibal Holocaust, that soundtrack to Cannibal Holocaust is great. It's really lovely and weirdly melodic and lyrical. On the other way round, the film that I've really you know, loved the film but haven't the soundtrack. Let me just reach over and grab this. Hang on, look. So this was my holiday reading. Okay, this is a book about the man who fell to earth. It was a gift. I was given it by one of my kids, I think. I'm a big David Bowie fan, and I don't tend to read enough. When, you know, if I do, I tend to read like a biography, usually a biography of Elvis or a book about the making of a film. And I've been thinking about Man Who Fell to Earth a lot recently. And one of the reasons I've been thinking about it a lot is there's this whole idea of the soundtrack that got away, because Bowie was meant to do the soundtrack and then it didn't happen. And there's various versions of why it didn't happen, you know, that he wasn't he wasn't that buzzed about doing it, or maybe there was a financial thing. Anyway, it ended up not being a Bowie soundtrack. And I interviewed Nick Rogue many, many years, like decades later. And Nick Rogue said that David Bowie had sent him a copy of Low and said, if you listen to side 2 of Low, this is what I would have done for the soundtrack. And of course, there's one piece particular, I think it's Subterraneans, that actually was devised from a piece that he had written for the soundtrack. And I've always thought, I watched Man Who Fell to Earth again just recently, and I thought, I love that film. It's so Nick Rogue, but how much better would it be if it had a Bowie soundtrack? If it did have the sound of the second side of Low, those strange, moody instrumental keyboard pieces, which are so great. So I mean, I think that's the. I know that they never finished recording it. For a long time, there was a whole thing about it. It existed out there, and it doesn't. There are fragments of it, but I would love that to have been the case, that there was a Bowie soundtrack for it.
Great answer, Mark. That's wonderful. It'll certainly make me look at that film in a whole new light.
Yeah. Are you a fan of it? Do you not like it, Brian?
No, I'm a big fan of it, but I haven't seen it for many years, and actually listening to that, I would love to rewatch it again. So I'm definitely going to look at it. Now, looking at the year that's just gone, Mark, you did, as always, halfway through publish your best and worst films of the year, which we like to look at. And obviously, the earlier part of the year was dominated by Parasite, of course, and it won the Academy Award, and it felt like a huge moment, in film history.
It was, Brian. It was a huge moment. It genuinely was. And it was, history was being made, and it really annoyed Donald Trump. So what more could you want?
And I think you and I both agreed that the most striking film that we saw in 2020 was Portrait of a Lady on Fire, which I thought was an extraordinary piece of work. And one of the things that it affected me in regard to was music itself, because for the first time, I actually realized that if you lived in the 18th century, you could only hear music if it was played live in front of you. And of course I knew that, but this film made me think that and realize it for the first time. Yeah.
I mean, the use of music in that film is really extraordinary, because obviously there's very little music in it. There's the big set piece at the end with the camera going in, but then there's the scene around the fire with the singing, which is so brilliantly done. And it's funny because we played that cue from the fire scene on Scala before I had seen the film. And I remember listening to it and thinking, this sounds incredible, but I can't figure out what it's accompanying. I can't. It's the scene from which the film gets its title, The Portrait of the Lady on Fire. No, it's wonderful, but it's you're right. There's huge amounts of silence. I mean, it's very noisy silence, but it's not incidental music silence. And so when you do hear music and it is performed live, you really, really notice it, and it has a really profound effect.
Now, maybe the film that had that cast the longest shadow over 2020 was actually a film that was not released in the cinema. It was slated to twice, but didn't happen, and that was the James Bond movie, A Time to Die. And I wonder, Mark, what your thoughts are on that at the moment, and the impact that has had on the film industry.
Well, the impact was devastating, and I think it's a mistake. What happened with the new Bond is there was all the delays. Originally, it was going to be Danny Boyle, and then that didn't happen, and then it fell down. It got back up again, and then it was meant to open, earlier in the year. And in fact, Bond was as far as I remember, was the first film to be pushed back due to COVID, because they announced very early, because I think what they did was they looked at cinemas internationally, I presume cinemas in China that were closing, and realised that because it's such a big part of the box office that they were going to have a problem. So they pushed it back, and they pushed it right back to the end of the year, and everybody went, wow. I mean, imagine what's involved in a big tentpole movie like that going back that far. Of course, then as everything with COVID happened, that started to look like, oh, well, actually, they were quite smart. It was quite a smart move to move it back rather than, Tenet kept moving back incrementally. But then Tenet did open. And I think the fact that it was coming up in November was, and I talked to, Phil Clapp from the UK Cinema Association about this, for many cinemas who have had a terrible time this year, it was, to use Phil Clapp's phrase, the last lifeboat. It was the thing that was going to see cinemas through to the end of the year, okay? And I think that it was, when it was announced that they were pushing it back, and they've now said they pushed it back into, it's spring of next year, but who knows what that's going to do. I think it was a mistake, and I think it was a mistake firstly because they did it at the last minute. They kept people hanging on till the very last minute, so they delayed it again. And secondly, obviously cinema box offices are down at the moment. In fact, cinemas in some places are closed. They're open in, some parts, but who knows? And we're recording this in the middle of October. By the time this interview goes out, Brian, I don't know what the situation is going to look like. But I spoke to cinema managers who said, we'll get through the end of the year as long as Bond doesn't slip. And then it did. And you could hear the collective groan. And then immediately afterwards, Cineworld announced that they were closing. And of course, that took down Picture House. And then a number of Odeon cinemas went to just weekends. And it all happened. It was a domino effect. And I know it wasn't just Bond. But I think that as a, nominally as a UK franchise, Bond, we always think of Bond as a British brand. I think it would have done them no harm at all to have stood their ground and said, no, we're gonna go with this. We know that box office will be diminished, but we're going to go with this. And I think the goodwill that they would have got from the industry, regardless of what happens, I think the fact that they were going to do it would have got them a lot of goodwill. My own feeling is that now it's like what they ended up with was headlines which could have been, oh, well done, Bond. It was like everyone went, oh. And I kind of feel like by the time we finally get to see this Bond film next year, we will have been waiting for it. It had better be really good, frankly, because most of us already, it's like, really? So I think it was an error. I mean, what do I know? It's a financial thing for them, clearly. But this sounds really naive and really stupid, Brian. But I think that there are times when something other than finance should have kicked in. I think it would have stood them in very good stead to have said, no, we're gonna okay, Tenet took a reduced amount of money, but they did it and well done, so we're gonna follow suit.
Now, in the light of that, Mark, there's a question here from Ross Byrne, who asks, what do you see as the most viable way for smaller art house cinemas to soldier on into the future post-COVID?
Well, post-COVID, I mean, if they've got to post-COVID, then I think the future is bright. I mean, the slightly more pressing version of that question is, how do we get to post-COVID? Because obviously art house cinemas, smaller cinemas, have had a terrible time of it. And it's been very, very difficult. And I've been saying the same thing, and I'll say it again. If you have an independent local art house cinema that you love, support it in every way you can. Obviously, if you can go there, if it's open at the moment, and you feel okay about going, then do. If you don't, there are other ways of supporting. There are buying membership cards. There are buying gift cards. There are some cinemas have got just giving pages. There are ways of standing by your local cinemas, whether or not you're going. And I can't stress this enough. I understand, at the time that this interview goes out, Brian, I don't know what the cinema landscape will be like because it's changing from minute to minute at the moment. It's open, it's closed, it's open, it's closed. And that's an incredibly difficult thing. So maybe when this is going out, cinemas have all been shut. Or maybe not. I don't know. Nobody knows from one minute to the next what's happening. But what we do know is that until we get back to some kind of normality, those cinemas are on an increasingly stretched existence, because for every month that you don't have a normal cinema attendance, you're struggling. And I just think you'll miss them if they're gone. So once we are post-COVID, whatever that means, whenever it is, I think there will be there will, you know, there's a whole bunch of movies waiting to be released, and you know, I think people will want to get back to the cinema. But I think at the moment it's just a matter of, if you go, great. If you don't, think about maybe other ways of supporting your cinema, and the ways of doing that are memberships, gift cards. Those things will help the cinemas get through this terrible time, because I think we all know that not everyone's going to come out the other end of this. Even the official position now of the UK Cinema Association is not everyone's going to make it to the end of COVID, in terms of cinemas actually staying head above water.
I'm sitting here in a virtual QFT, but the one thing that I know about this place, it has survived the troubles, it survived the rise of multiplexes, the home entertainment in terms of video, and obviously now into COVID, but the spirit of the staff and the actual patrons here is to keep this cinema alive, because it means so much to the community here, and I think that is going to see us through COVID, hopefully.
Well, I think that's wonderfully reassuring. As I said, I mean, at the moment that we're having this conversation, I'm in the New Forest, where actually we're in a fairly, we're in a relatively low risk area. I know that Belfast at the moment is having a very, very difficult time of it, and obviously the QFT is closed at the moment, so you're having to sit in front of a virtual picture of it, which is breaking my heart, because QFT has been so good to me. It's been so welcoming. I mean, Cinemagic every year, it's one of the highlights of my year, is coming over and being there. But I think you're right. I think that it's the spirit of the staff and the spirit of the patrons will keep it going. And I just wish and hope that every independent cinema has that same thing, has that same support, has that same sense of being needed and loved and nurtured. Because you'll miss it if it's gone.
Now, we do have good news. Secrets of, yes, we have good news. Secrets of Cinema is returning for 3 new episodes. So please tell us what those episodes are, and tell us also what is the secret of Secrets of Cinema? Why has this taken off in such a way?
Well, I mean, to answer that first, I think the honest answer is that it's a brilliant team, and Kim Newman, who is the kind of lead writer, who is just encyclopedic in his knowledge. And Kim and I have written stuff together before, but when the programme was originally what happened was BBC4 wanted a very different programme, and we said, well, we're not very interested in doing that, but we are interested in doing this. And I said, this has to be written with Kim. That's it. There's no other way of doing it, because there's nobody else who's got that kind of encyclopedic knowledge. And then, Nick Jones and John Dass, who have been, directing and producing. And then Jane Long, who is our archive editor, the person in charge of doing the archive research, who is unbelievable. I mean, just an absolute wealth of archive. So it is a real team effort. I mean, the way those programs get written is that we all sit in a room. I mean, actually, the way we've done this is we've had to do virtual room, but usually we'd sit in Kim's front room, and it would be the group of us, and we would just, spitball the whole programs. What about that? What about that? What's that film in which, and how do you do, and what is that thing? And then, of course, we've got Neil Brand doing the music, which is great. So, I mean, it's actually a program which has got original music, because Neil Brand is such a hero of mine, and he's been so supportive and, so great all the way through. So I think the reason it's good, Brian, is that it's a team. This is not, although it's called Mark Kermode's Secrets of Cinema, it shouldn't be called that. It should be called Mark Kermode's Friends' Secrets of Cinema. I am, of all of the people in it, the least deserving of any credit at all, because I'm involved in the writing process, and I'm involved, obviously I present it and everything, but it's not, there's a very great difference between that and, for example, when Mark Cousins does his stuff, that's very much Mark. It's absolutely Mark. This Secrets of Cinema is much more of a team. It's the group of us, because I need all that support, but I love it as well. There's nothing that I love more than being in a room with Kim and Jane and Nick and John and going, okay, so the subjects that we're doing one on pop movies, which, funnily enough, when I get off from this, I have to start writing that script. We're doing one on cult movies, which Kim has already done, like a thing of, which is about the length of War and Peace. And then we're doing one on British comedy, which is very much John Dass's area. John was the kind of the leading driving force on the British historical movies one. And so it's a matter of kind of just playing to everybody's particular strengths and, whatever. So that's usually the way it breaks down with any series, is that each episode has got somebody leading on it. So, so when we did disaster movies, that was very much mine. And when we did horror movies, it was me and Kim were sort of, pretty much equal footing. When we did, I said that the British historical one, that was very much John. And that's how it's worked out. And so, so pop movies, cult movies, British comedy, we're in the process of writing them now. They're really great. And I'm already starting to look at the clips, and they're brilliant. But I don't say this to be self-effacing. That program is great because it is a great team, and it's been the greatest joy being with that team of people, and they are just wonderful. And I'm very proud to have my name on it, but frankly, it should have their names on it.
And when can we look forward to seeing those 3 episodes, Mark?
Well, we're filming them at the end of November, beginning of December. So I think it'll be in the run up to or around about Christmas. I think. I mean, obviously, as you know, with BBC transmission dates, you'll know this, Brian, more than anybody else. It's like, when's the transmission date? I don't know. But, as soon as I know, I'll tweet the hell out of it. But it's end of the year, I think, is the thing. And obviously, as far as the filming is concerned, we're having to work in a socially distant. We have to figure out the logistics of how to do it, but because it's a one-person presentation thing, it's not that difficult. It's quite a stripped down crew. It's cameraman and then production. You can spread it all out. I think the main thing that's going to be different is is just things like with makeup. I mean, I know this sounds ridiculous, but when I'm doing that program, I've got makeup on. You wouldn't know because I look normal, but it's, as you know, Brian, if you film somebody without makeup on, they look weird. I mean, not that I don't look weird, but so then I don't know. There has to be a whole conversation about how that works out. But I'm sure there's stuff in place. There's protocols in place, so we can do it. It'll just be it'll be a stripped down, smaller team, but we'll get it done.
We have a few final questions here from social media. So Jessica Pinder asks, given how challenging this year has been, if you could choose one film to watch as we near the end of 2020 to lift our spirits, what would you pick? One film from 2020 or just one film from anywhere at all? Maybe both, or maybe whatever you feel.
Well, if it's one film from 2020, and I know that some people might have said it, but I would go for The Personal History of David Copperfield, because I just thought that was such a wonderfully uplifting, inclusive. I just thought it was just a demonstration of what the future can look like. You can make a movie like this. You can take an established text that has all those problems with it being, and you can do it in a way that just throws all those rules out the window and is funny. And so I thought that film was absolutely lovely. Also, of course, Morveth Clark is brilliant in it, in a dual role, and of course she's absolutely brilliant in Saint Maud, which is. And Mark, as you say, with that film, we had colorblind casting, and that really points, kind of towards the future. It's the future, kids. I mean, it's just like, one of the things I really love is when you're at a moment in which history happens regardless of what people think of it, And I remember when people talked about colourblind casting and they would be sniffy about it. And then you look at David Copperfield, you go, well, get on board, because this is the future. And of course it is. And hooray. And, it's weird the things people get hung up on. They say they have a problem with colourblind casting, but they don't have a problem with special effects, which have got spaceships flying through holes in the space-time continuum. You go, why are you fixating on this stuff? And I thought the best thing about David Copperfield was that it's not the first thing you say about it. You go, it's a brilliant adaptation and it's really funny and it's really great. And incidentally, it's colourblind casting. That's not the defining factor of it, but it is probably the most subversive thing about it. So I think that's and in terms of all time, well, It's a Wonderful Life, because when I have no problem with saying this, when Trump got elected, I tweeted that picture of Jimmy Stewart, suddenly realizing that the town had turned into hell. And I do feel like that. And I really want Bedford Falls back again.
Yeah. Not Pottersville.
No, and that was the thing. And here's what's brilliant about it. I literally just tweeted a picture of him standing next to that sign, and everyone knew. Everyone knew what that meant.
Final social media question here from Peter Davison, who asks, is there a film slated for next year that you can't wait to see on the big screen? And that's the big point here, isn't it? The big screen.
I mean, the honest answer to that is every single film that will be released next year, I can't wait to see on the big screen, because you must feel the same way about this, Brian. I mean, I just want to be back. I want to be back. And so I know there are so many other things involved in what's going on at the moment, but I just want to be back in the cinema. So honestly, absolutely anything. I don't care what it is. I will go and see anything in the cinema as soon as possible, because I just want to be back.
Now, Mark, we've come to the end of our time, and you have picked a film for this year's film night. And yep. I know you're going to introduce that film for the audience, but the one thing I would say about your role as a film critic and what you've done over the years is that you've been able to champion certain films, maybe films of a lower budget or that don't get a great kind of distribution. And I wonder how important that is in your role as a film critic.
I think, you and I have talked about this before. I think if there's any purpose to film criticism at all, it is exactly that. It's just being able to say, look, here's something you might not have heard of. Here's something you might be interested in that you wouldn't, here's something that's worth seeing. I honestly think, I've been a film critic now for over 30 years, and I'm starting to look towards, I'm going to retire at some point because I'm an old fart. And there's a new no, I'm serious. I'm not just saying this. I mean, because there comes a point when, you need to just make way. But I think the things I'm most proud of is having flown the flag for a couple of little films that people might not otherwise have seen. And I think that is, if there is a purpose to film criticism, it is that. It's not kicking big Hollywood blockbusters, because who cares, It's going, this little weird German movie is really great.
Well, Mark, listen, it's always a pleasure to talk to you. Thank you for being part of Cinemagic 2020 virtually. This time
pleasure.
Next year, we will be back in QFT, the real QFT, not the virtual QFT, and we will have a proper party. Well,
look, I can't wait to be back. I really miss it, and I'm really glad that you invite me every year. It's one of the highlights of my year. I love coming to Belfast. As I said, we have friends and godchildren there, and it's how I feel about it. I really love it, and I'm really grateful and honoured that you've had me back over all these years, and I cannot wait to get back and and be there and have a drink in the bar and show you some other disastrous 70s movie that meant a lot to me when I was a 12-year-old.
Well, Mark, stay safe, and we'll see you next year. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Brian. As always, lots of love. Hello, this is Mark Kermode. Welcome to this Cinemagic screening of Bait, which is one of my favourite movies of recent years. I have a kind of personal investment in Bait, which I think has become like a defining independent film. And it was many years ago. I was down in Cornwall, and I was doing. I spent quite a lot of time in Cornwall, and I was doing a gig in a building that was being turned into a cinema. It was becoming the Newlyn Film House, and before that it had been a fish processing factory, and it was somewhere between being a fish processing factory and then what it was going to become was a cinema. And I was playing with a friend of mine, Tom Rickman, who's an artist, and we were just playing to provide some music, and because we played acoustically and we do sort of blues jamming, and somebody was there and they took a photograph of us, and sometime later I get this thing in the post, and it's this picture, and it's the most... Actually, I can show it to you. Hang on one second. This is how well planned this is. So this is the picture that they took, okay? You see that? I'll show it to that as well. This is this absolutely brilliant photograph, and it makes me look like I'm in the, like some kind of... American boxcar, busking, and it's everything that I fantasize about being. And this photograph came in a couple of prints, and it had been developed by the photographer using a coffee-based developer that he had invented, because he wanted to make a developing thing that didn't have any toxic side effects. And that guy turned out to be Mark Jenkin. And Mark Jenkin was at that point exploring, working with clockwork cameras and 16mm film that he would shoot these little shorts on, and he would post-sync the sound. And what had happened was that he'd been working in video and he had kind of lost his love of cinema. And then he'd seen Mark Cousins' The Story of Film, and he had rekindled his love of cinema by getting back into the nitty-gritty of film itself. Anyway, I then got to know Mark, and he showed me a short film, a 45-minute short, called Bronco's House, which was made with clockwork cameras and post-synced sound and this kind of hand-developed film that he'd done in his studio in Newlyn. And it was brilliant. And he said to me, I'm going to make a feature like this. And I said, yeah, good luck with that. Fast forward a couple of years later, and Bait comes out, and it is miraculous. It is this extraordinary film, which is about Cornwall and about, what happens in a situation in a small fishing village in which a house that, used to be a fishing house has now been turned into a tourist thing. And it's about, incomers and outsiders, and it's just a brilliant piece of work, but it's shot using this extraordinary technique. And the reason it strikes me as important is threefold. Firstly, it is a brilliant film and an authentic Cornish film by an authentic Cornish genius. Secondly, it is a film in which form and content are perfectly combined, because within the format of that film, you have past, present, and future all tied together. So everything about the way the film is made, everything about the way the film looks, everything about the way the film is created is tied up with the subject matter of the film. And thirdly, because when that filmmaker told a film critic that he was going to do it, the film critic said, yeah, good luck with that. So if you want to know about the future of cinema, never ask a film critic. Ask a filmmaker, because that's how cinema gets pushed forward, by people like Mark Jenkin going, I'm going to do this because it's the right way to do it, and I don't care what anyone else thinks. It's an absolute masterpiece. I hope you love it as much as I do.